Night my father announced he was handing the company to my brother, he looked straight at me and said, "You were never built for this." I was standing maybe 10 feet away, close enough to see the satisfaction in his eyes, close enough to hear my sister-in-law laugh, not loudly, just enough. The kind of laugh that says we all knew this was coming. I didn't cry. I wanted to. But I'd been practicing not crying in front of them for about 15 years by that point, so I just picked up my glass of sparkling water and took a slow sip, and looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, like I was thinking about something else entirely. I wasn't thinking about something else. I was thinking I owned 3 buildings in this city. Let me back up. My father built Caldwell Industrial Supply from nothing. That's the version of the story he tells at every dinner, every holiday, every function where there's more than 4 people present. He started with a warehouse in Gary, Indiana, a second-hand truck, and what he calls the Caldwell work ethic. By the time I was born, the youngest of 3, the only girl, it had grown into a mid-sized regional distributor doing maybe $40 million a year in revenue. My oldest brother Patrick was groomed from the beginning. Dad took him to the warehouse on Saturdays when Patrick was 7. By high school, Patrick had a desk in the office with his name on a little wooden plaque. By college, everyone understood that Patrick would run Caldwell one day. It wasn't discussed. It just was. My other brother, Derek, was the golden child in a different way. He was charming, funny, the kind of person who walked into a room and made everyone feel like they'd been waiting for him. Dad adored Derek, called him the face of this family. Derek never had much interest in the business, but that was fine. He was excused from expectation by sheer personality. And then there was me. I don't want to make it sound like I was Cinderella, because I wasn't. I had clothes and food and a roof. I went to a good school. My mother was not unkind exactly. She was just absent in the way that people are absent when they're physically present but emotionally checked out. She orbited my father completely. Whatever he thought, she thought. Whatever he valued, she valued. And my father did not value me, not in a dramatic storybook way. It was subtler than that. It was the way he'd ask Patrick about his grades and then remember to ask about mine only as an afterthought. It was the way Derek's baseball games were family events but my academic competitions were scheduling conflicts. It was the way he'd say things like, "You're smart, but not in a business way," and genuinely mean it as a neutral observation. I was 17 when I told him I wanted to study finance. He laughed. Not meanly, just reflexively, like I'd said something slightly absurd. "What would you do with that?" he said. I got a full scholarship to Northwestern. He told the relatives I'd gotten into a good school up north. I got my MBA from Booth. He told people I was still in school. I stopped telling him things after that. What I didn't tell him, what I didn't tell anyone in that family, was what I'd been building. It started small. My junior year of undergrad, I took a part-time job at a small property management firm in Evanston. The owner, Mr. Thibodeau, was 63 and tired and had a portfolio of 12 residential units he'd accumulated over 30 years and no real system for managing any of it. I built him a system. Spreadsheets at first, then software, then I helped him refinance 2 properties and used the equity to acquire a third. He gave me a small commission. I saved every dollar. After graduation, I kept working for him while I applied to MBA programs. I also started reading, obsessively, compulsively, the way some people watch television. Everything I could find about real estate acquisition, commercial leasing, cap rates, 1031 exchanges, opportunity zones. I had no money. I had knowledge. The knowledge, it turned out, was enough to start. My first deal was a 4-unit building in Pilsen that had been sitting on the market for 8 months because the seller was asking above market and nobody wanted to deal with the tenant situation. I spent 2 weeks researching the property, the tenants, the seller's motivations. Then I approached the seller directly, explained exactly why his price was wrong, and offered him a fair number with a fast close. He took it. I didn't have the down payment. I found it. A combination of a small loan from Mr. Thibodeau, a private investor I'd met through a networking event, and every dollar I had in savings. I was 26 years old. I was terrified for approximately 90 days straight. And then the building cash flowed and the terror turned into something else. I kept my name off everything, not to be secretive. At first it was just practical. I used an LLC, the way everyone does. The LLC was called Meridian Property Group. Nobody knew Meridian was me. I didn't advertise it. I just worked. By the time I finished my MBA, Meridian had 4 properties. By the time I was 30, it had 19. By 32, I'd completed my first commercial acquisition, a mixed-use building in the West Loop that a retiring owner wanted to sell quietly without a broker. I gave him his price. He handed me the keys. I hired a small team. I kept a low profile. I did not go to industry events, did not seek press, did not network in the circles where people might connect my name to the portfolio. I'd watched too many people talk themselves into trouble by announcing their success before it was solid. I wanted solid first. I got solid. What I had by the time of my father's anniversary gala was a commercial and residential portfolio worth approximately $340 million, held across 7 LLCs all under the Meridian umbrella. A profile in a trade publication had called Meridian one of the most quietly aggressive mid-market acquirers in the Chicago metro. They had a name for the entity. They did not have a name for me. I was 33 years old. I had not told my father any of this. I'm not sure what I was waiting for. Maybe I wasn't waiting for anything. Maybe I just liked the silence of it, the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction of knowing something that nobody in that house knew. The gala was my father's idea. 30 years of Caldwell Industrial Supply. He rented out a private dining room at a hotel in the Gold Coast, invited about 80 people, family, long-time employees, a few business contacts. My mother wore a new dress. Derek made a toast that was 80% a story about himself and 20% about my father, which everyone found charming. I almost didn't go. I'd been to enough of these events to know the basic shape of them. Patrick would be at my father's right hand, Derek would work the room. I would stand near the bar and have pleasant, forgettable conversations with people who weren't sure exactly what I did. I went because my grandmother asked me to. She's 81 and sharp as a tack, and she doesn't ask me for much, so when she does, I don't say no. We arrived together, she and I, and she held my arm and told me I looked beautiful. And I believed her because she's the only person in my family who has never once said anything to me she didn't mean. For the first hour it was fine. I talked to my grandmother, talked to a few of my father's older employees who I've known since I was a kid, had 1 glass of wine, ate something small from a passing tray. Derek found me at one point, gave me a one-armed hug, told me I looked super professional, which is the thing he says when he doesn't know what else to say. Patrick found me later and asked what I'd been up to. I said work. He nodded like that was a sufficient answer and moved on. Patrick and I have never been close, not enemies, just parallel. We've never had enough in common to fight about anything. My father gave his speech around 8:30. It was the speech I'd been hearing variations of my entire life. The warehouse in Gary, the second-hand truck, the Caldwell work ethic. Then he talked about the future of the company. He talked about Patrick stepping up as president, which was not news. And then he said, and this is the part that made the room very quiet, that he decided to transfer majority ownership of Caldwell Industrial Supply, all of it to Patrick, outright. People started clapping. My mother touched her heart. He looked at Patrick and said, "You're everything I built this for." Then he looked at Derek and said, "And you're the heart of this family." And then he looked at me. I don't know what I expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe I'd stopped expecting anything years ago. But he held my gaze for just a moment and said, "And my daughter, well, she's always done her own thing." He said it warmly. Like a joke almost. The room chuckled softly, and he moved on to thanking his employees. She's always done her own thing. I stood there and thought about my 19-building residential portfolio and my 8 commercial properties and the development project we were breaking ground on in the spring, and I thought, yes, I have. I was getting my coat from the check-in table near the entrance when a man I didn't recognize approached me. He was somewhere around 40, wearing a jacket that was slightly too academic for the room, carrying a small notebook, actual paper, which I noticed because nobody carries those anymore. He had the specific quality of alertness that I've come to associate with journalists, still watching like he's filing everything away. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm sorry to bother you. Are you with the Caldwell family?" I said I was. He introduced himself. His name was Jordan. He said he was a reporter, freelance, writing a piece for a real estate industry publication about mid-market commercial acquisitions in Chicago over the past decade. He said he'd been trying to track down the principals behind a portfolio called Meridian Property Group for about 3 months. I felt something drop in my stomach. He said, "We've identified the portfolio. The properties, the LLCs, the transaction history, it's pretty well documented at this point. But we haven't been able to put a name to it. The operating agreement on the primary LLC lists a registered agent but no individual principals. It's unusual." He paused. "I happen to be here tonight doing a completely separate interview with one of your father's business contacts, and then I heard someone mention the name Caldwell, and I pulled up my notes, and the address on one of the Meridian filings is registered to a Caldwell." He looked at me with the careful patience of someone who already knows the answer to the question they're about to ask. "Is that you?" I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about saying no. Or, "I'm not sure what you're referring to." Or just "excuse me" and walking to the elevator. All reasonable options. Instead I said, "What publication did you say this was for?" He told me. It was one of the more respected trade outlets covering commercial real estate nationally. I'd read their coverage for years. I said, "Can we talk somewhere quieter?" We found a corner of the lobby, away from the noise of the dining room. I spent about 20 minutes with him. I answered his questions carefully. Not evasively, just carefully, the way I answer any professional question. Yes, Meridian was mine. Yes, I'd built it over the past decade. Yes, the portfolio was approximately the size he'd estimated, and in fact slightly larger. He kept writing in his notebook. At one point he looked up and said, "You've essentially built one of the most significant private real estate portfolios in the Chicago metro in the last 10 years, and nobody knows your name." I said, "I know my name." He almost smiled. We exchanged cards. He said the piece would probably run within the next few weeks, pending editorial. I thanked him, put on my coat, and went back into the dining room to say goodbye to my grandmother. She was sitting with my mother when I found her. My mother asked if I was leaving already. I said yes, early morning. She nodded vaguely. My father was nearby talking to Patrick. He didn't look up. I kissed my grandmother's cheek. She held my hand for a moment and looked at me with those sharp, clear eyes of hers and said quietly, "You doing okay, sweetheart?" I said yes. And I meant it. I meant it more than I had in a long time, actually, because somewhere in the last 20 minutes something had shifted, not in me, but in the story. The story I'd been living in my own head for years, the one where I was invisible and overlooked, and always just outside the circle of warmth. That story had quietly stopped being true. I'd been so busy building the actual one that I hadn't noticed. I said goodbye. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the lobby button and watched the dining room doors close. My phone buzzed in my bag. A text from Jordan. "Just want to confirm. I'll send you a preview of the relevant sections before we publish. Thanks for your time tonight. This is going to be a great piece." I put the phone back in my bag and looked at my reflection in the elevator doors. I looked tired. I looked fine. The piece ran 5 weeks later. I knew it was going to be significant. Jordan had told me as much when he sent the preview. It led the issue, ran about 4,000 words, included a photograph of one of the Meridian properties and one of me, which I had approved, standing outside the West Loop building with my arms crossed like I was just a normal person who owned things, which I was. The headline was something like, "The Quiet Architect, How One Investor Built a 340 mil portfolio. Nobody was watching." I found out what happened at my family's house from my grandmother, who called me that Sunday afternoon. "Your father saw the article," she said. She had a particular tone she used when she was being diplomatic. careful and measured, like she was choosing each word individually. She used that tone now. I waited. She paused. He's processing. What does that mean? It means he sat in his study for about 2 hours after Patrick showed it to him, and when he came out, he didn't say much. She paused again. He asked me if I knew. What did you tell him? I told him I knew you were successful, which is true. I just didn't know the specifics. I thanked her. We talked for a few more minutes about other things, her garden, a book she was reading, and then we hung up. My phone started ringing about an hour later. First Patrick, then Derek. Then a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be my sister-in-law, calling from a different phone for reasons that were unclear but that I found somewhat amusing. I let them all go to voicemail. My father called at 7 p.m. I watched his name on the screen for 4 rings, and then I answered because I decided I wanted to hear what he would say. He said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "Tell you what?" He said, "Don't do that. The article, the portfolio, all of it." I said, "I don't remember you asking." There was a silence. Then he said, $340 million, and you never said a word. I said, "Dad, you told a room full of people that I'd always done my own thing. You were right. This is my own thing." Another silence. He said, "I want you to come to dinner. We need to talk about this." I said, "I know you do." He said, "So you'll come?" I thought about every dinner I'd sat through where my accomplishments went unmentioned while Patrick's quarterly numbers got a standing ovation. I thought about the gala 5 weeks prior and the way he'd looked at me with that almost worn dismissal. She's always done her own thing and moved on. I said, "I'll think about it." He started to say something else and I said, "Good night, Dad," and ended the call. I didn't go to dinner that week or the next. Derek texted me something long and confusing that seemed to be half apology and half suggestion that I might want to invest in a restaurant concept he was developing, which honestly I respected for its efficiency if nothing else. Patrick sent a formal email, which was very Patrick, 3 paragraphs, proper salutation, subject line that read, "Catching up." He said he'd always admired my work ethic. He said we should get coffee. I wrote back a 1-line reply saying that sounded good and left it open-ended in the way that means it won't happen soon. My mother called on a Thursday evening. She said she missed me. She said she hoped I knew how proud she was. I said thank you, because what else do you say? She asked if I was happy. I said yes. She said, "You always were so independent." She meant it as a compliment. I know she did. But there's a version of independent that means we didn't make enough room for you, and so you learned to take up no space, and I'm not sure she understands that those two things aren't the same. I told her I'd call her soon and we hung up. I went to see my grandmother the following Saturday. She lives in a house in Oak Park that she's been in for 40 years. The kind of house with a front porch and a kitchen that always smells like something baking, even when nothing is baking. I brought her a plant because she likes plants. We sat at her kitchen table and she made coffee and she didn't mention the article for about 40 minutes, which I appreciated. We talked about her neighbour's dog and a documentary she'd been watching and whether Oak Park was changing too fast. And then she poured more coffee and looked at me and said, "Are you angry at them?" I thought about it honestly. "Not really," I said. "I think I was angry for a long time, but I'd been so busy that there wasn't much room left for it." She nodded. "Do you want a relationship with your father?" she asked. "Direct." She's always been direct. "I want him to see me," I said. "But I'm not sure that's something I can want for very much longer, because waiting for it has cost me things." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He does see you now." "Yeah," I said, "now that there's $340 million to see." She didn't argue with that. She just reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and we sat like that for a minute, and it was enough. My father and I had dinner eventually. 6 weeks after the article ran, a restaurant he chose, downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a sommelier and portions that are thoughtfully small. He was already there when I arrived. He stood up when he saw me, which he'd never done before, not that I could remember. He looked older. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way people look when something they thought was true turns out not to be. We ordered, we made small talk, and then he put down his fork and looked at me and said, "I underestimated you." I said, "Yes." He nodded slowly. He seemed to be waiting for me to say something else, to offer him the reassurance, to say, "But that's okay," or "I understand," or any of the softening phrases that women are taught to offer when men finally admit to failing them. I didn't offer them. I just picked up my fork and cut into my fish. He said, "I want to do better." I said, "I know." He said, "Will you give me the chance?" I looked at him across the table. This man who had said she was never built for this without even meaning it cruelly, who had distributed his love and his belief like resources there was only so much of, and given most of both to my brothers without ever really noticing what he wasn't giving me. I said, "I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but I'm here." He nodded. He looked, relieved isn't quite the right word, more like someone who's been bracing for a door to close and found it still slightly open. We finished dinner, he paid, which he always does, and I let him, which I don't always do. Outside on the sidewalk he hugged me. A real hug, longer than usual. I hugged him back. We didn't fix anything that night. You don't fix 15 years of not being seen over Chilean sea bass and a glass of Chardonnay. But something shifted, the way things shift when the truth is finally out in the room and everyone has to figure out how to stand in it. I walked to my car and sat there for a minute in the dark before I started the engine. I thought about the girl who drove to Pilsen at 26 to look at a 4-unit building she had no business buying. I thought about the 5 years of 6 a.m. mornings and spreadsheets and calls with lenders and the specific loneliness of building something you couldn't tell anyone about. I thought about standing in that dining room at my father's gala, holding a glass of sparkling water, looking at the skyline. 3 buildings in this city, that was what I was thinking. 3 buildings, now it was 27. I started the engine, I drove home. The skyline, as always, was lit up and enormous and indifferent to all of it. The way cities are, the way the world is, the way success is if you build it for yourself instead of for an audience that wasn't paying attention anyway. I had built it for myself. That, in the end, was the whole point. I've thought a lot about what actually happened that night at the gala. Not the dramatic version, not the freeze-frame moment where the room goes quiet and everyone realizes they had me wrong. I mean the quieter thing underneath it. The thing that was true long before Jordan ever walked up to me in that lobby with his notebook. My father didn't fail me in a single moment. He failed me in 10,000 small ones. The Saturday mornings he took Patrick to the warehouse and didn't think to ask if I wanted to come. The dinner table conversations about business that somehow always curved away from me. The way he'd listen to my brothers finish a sentence and interrupt me before I finished mine. None of it was violent, none of it was even intentional, probably. It was just the slow accumulation of a man who had already decided before I was old enough to prove him wrong what I was capable of. And here's what I've come to understand about that. It shaped me in ways I'm still untangling, but it also built something in me that nothing else could have. When nobody is watching you, you stop performing. When nobody is expecting anything from you, you stop building for approval. You build for the thing itself. For the work. For the quiet satisfaction of a deal that closes right, a property that cash flows, a portfolio that grows in the dark while everyone else is busy looking somewhere else. That's not a gift I would have chosen, but I'm not sure I give it back. What I want to say, not just to people who share my specific story, but to anyone who has ever been the one the room forgot, is this: the invisibility is not the punishment it feels like. It is, in a strange and painful way, a kind of freedom. Nobody was monitoring my choices. Nobody was second-guessing my deals. Nobody was waiting to say I told you so if something went sideways, because nobody believed I was doing anything worth watching. That space, as lonely as it was entirely mine. The discipline it took to fill that space. To show up at 6 in the morning when there was no one to see it. To make the hard call with a lender when there was no mentor to ask. To believe in a deal that everyone else had passed on. That discipline was not something I was born with. I built it the same way I built the portfolio, incrementally, imperfectly, one decision at a time. There is no other way, Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. And the integrity piece, that's the part I think about most now. I kept Meridian private not because I was hiding, but because I refused to let my success become a conversation about my family. I wanted it clean. I wanted it mine. That choice cost me things. There were moments when I was lonely in a way that's hard to describe. Moments when I wanted to pick up the phone and tell someone what I was building, but I held the line. And because I held it, when the truth finally came out, it came out whole. Nobody could touch it. Nobody could claim a piece of it. It was just the truth, standing on its own. My father sees me now. I'm not naive enough to think that's entirely separate from the $340 million. But I'm also not so cynical that I believe it's only about the money. I think he genuinely didn't know who I was. And I think that not knowing says more about the assumptions we make about the people closest to us than it does about me. I left that dinner with him and sat in my car for a few minutes and looked at the city I'd quietly bought pieces of for a decade. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something smaller and steadier than that. Something that doesn't have a clean name. I felt like a person who had done the work and had the life to show for it. That's the whole story. That's all it ever needed to be.